What up, YouTube? It is Thursday, May 17th, a day before my birthday. I will be turning the ripe old age of 35. Officially an old man. I decided to take the day off, met up with a friend to celebrate her birthday, which is actually today, had brunch, and also my wife has a doctor's appointment later on today. I figured there just wasn't enough time, decided I would recap the next session from my last vlog, and use this time for that purpose. Take the day off. I was out late last night hanging out with friends. Put in a little bit of a night session, which I'll be recapping later. So decided today would best be served kind of getting into that next session. So let's jump into that right now. It's a really fun one, and I think you're going to enjoy some of the hands that I get involved with. So when I arrived, there's a short-handed must-move game. I think we're 5 or 6-handed. Which I'm a big fan of. I enjoy playing short-handed, especially with opponents who I think are just going to be weaker. There is a player who decides to straddle. She actually ends up straddling, I think, like 3 hands in a row because a couple of new players do join, and it gives her the opportunity to straddle like back to back to back, which doesn't happen very often. In this specific hand, I think it's her first time straddling, so she straddles 5-handed, and I have 10-9 of hearts. I make it 35. She likes to defend really, really wide, and I think just in general, most players don't like folding their straddle. You'll find few and far between someone's going to put up 10 in a situation and almost fold like any 2 cards unless it's literally the bottom of the range, perhaps something like 9 deuce, 10-4, things of that nature. Obviously offsuit. I think if they're suited, they're calling 100% of the time. So I open to 35 with 10-9 suited. It folds to her, and she calls, which, as I said, I expect her to be doing, just really, really wide. We go heads up to a flop of 9-8-6 with 1 heart, about as good a flop as I'm going to get. She checks, and I decide to bet 45. Again, she's not playing very deep, so really I'm hoping that she's willing to possibly check raise some of her draws in these situations. Unfortunately for me, she just calls. The turn is the 5 of hearts. 7 now makes a straight, but I do pick up a flush draw. She checks, and I check it back. I think, again, here is going to be a situation where I'm probably going to be way ahead. Most of the time, some percentage of the time, I am going to be behind. I expect sometimes a 7 to just lead here on the turn. It is obviously also possible that she has like 2 pair, things of that nature. But I think this is a great spot to be checking back and calling just a large majority of rivers. It's going to look a lot like I have ace-high types of hands, so I think she can often be turning almost anything that she has into a bluff. The river is an offsuit 10. Now I make top 2. Which is obviously just a great hand for me in this spot. I lose to pretty much nothing except the 7, or possibly some flop sets, which I think heads up are going to raise a decent percentage of the time. At this point, she bets 100, and I snap it off. Like I said, I expect her to be bluffing a lot. Unfortunately for me, she has 7 deuce offsuit and does flop open-ended. And thankfully, she didn't raise this flop because, as I said, I was more than happy to get it in with top pair here. So right off the bat, we lose this pot, and we're stuck maybe around like $170. This next hand, it's a fun one. So it's a straddle pot. I am in the big blind. There's an early position opener to 20, and he gets 4 callers. When somebody opens to a min raise in a straddle pot, I think it's usually one of 2 things. It's like a hand that somebody just wants to play and doesn't want to play for a limp and get raised. And then also there's a percentage of time where it's going to be something like aces or kings. They're looking to make like some small raise and hoping that somebody attacks their weakness, and now they can stuff it in. As I mentioned, I'm in the big blind. I have ace-5 of diamonds. I think this makes for a great candidate to be squeezing with. I block, the strong combinations of ace-king, ace-queen, pocket aces. My hand is going to play well post-flop if I do get called, and it's not that great of a hand to be playing anyway, so if I do get stuffed on, I can just fold it. I decide that, multi-way, this hand has way too much value. I'd much rather play a pot where I can possibly flush over flush somebody. So I call 15 more, and the straddle calls 10 more. We go 6 ways to a flop of 6-3 deuce with 2 diamonds. So I flop the gut shot straight draw, an over, and the nut flush draw. Small blind checks, and at this point I decide I want to 3-bet this hand. I don't necessarily want to be check raising because I think a lot of times it's going to look like I have a flush draw. And I think it's just going to be a lot stronger if I bet, get raised, and now I can stuff it in there with what's going to be a lot of equity. I decided to lead for 80 into 120. Obviously, in this case, having the 5 blocker is key. I do block the nutted hands of 4-5, which I'm going to have a lot here when I decide to lead on this board multi-way. The straddler now makes it 220. He's an interesting player. He's been playing a lot lately and running pretty good. I think he's been feeling a bit overconfident in a number of spots with some gut shots, some bad flush draws, things of that nature, where he's just been winning a lot of pots. So I think he's overvaluing hands, just feeling like he can't lose. He at this point makes it 220, folds back to me, and when he does this, I just feel like the small raise isn't particularly strong. I think you can have some pair plus gut shots. Obviously, some hands like bottom two pair. I expect straight here to be raising larger because of the flush draw. Just who this opponent is, I think he's going to be raising me larger on this flop. Obviously, I don't want to just call here and brick some turns out of position. I think my hand has like a lot of equity against just a majority of hands, obviously, except the made straight, some sets. But it just doesn't feel like that's what he has in this case. I decided to stuff it in for, I think, 700 or 800 more. It's a large raise. And I think at this point, there's a player at the table who's aware of the vlog and asks me, hey, do you want me to record? And I kind of joke, I'm like, no. And I'm like, this pod's going to be really interesting. So I decided to record myself so we can run that footage here. I'm not entirely sure if I can run the audio from that because there are some voices. But to make a long story short, at this point, the player who made it 220 tanks for a bit. So at this point, I think he says something along the lines like, all right, I'll pay you off.
I'll pay you off.
The turn is a 7, and the river is an offsuit 6, so I end up having ace high.
You win ace high.
I announce ace high and show my hands. He looks at it for a bit, looks back at his hands, and I actually get this point when he says, like, I'll pay you off or I'll gamble with you. I actually thought it's quite possible he could have some, like, worse flush draws. Some hands like 10x of diamonds, king x of diamonds, things of that nature. So I thought it was actually quite possible I have the best hand. Just looking at the board, I had even announced ace high. So I expect if he has a pair or something better than a pair, he would show pretty quickly once I announce ace high. Unfortunately for me, he finally rolls over 5 deuce offsuit for a pair of 2s. And I say to him something along the lines, it's a player I play often with. I'm like, cool slow roll, dude. And he's like, oh, come on, like, I'm not slow rolling you or whatever. I obviously think it's a slow roll. I announce my hand as ace high. He looks at it for a bit. Obviously, I think the most likely situation is he's afraid that I don't have ace high or that maybe I hit something because he has bottom pair in this monster pot. He probably doesn't want to show if he doesn't have to. Like, if he shows his bottom pair and I end up having something better, then he's going to feel really silly. So I think he was just wanted to double check the board, make sure that pair of deuces is a winner before he shows. So pretty unfortunate for me. A really light call from him. I think this is kind of a best case scenario for him that I do have like the nut flush draw. I think what happens here is a similar situation where he's been running so good that he's like, well, even if I am behind, I can hit a 4 to make a wheel and just decides to like gamble it off. I can't really speak for him as to what his decision-making process is. Maybe he does put me on a flush draw. I think that's kind of a best case scenario, and calling this jam is just too much with this particular hand. He can call with much better hands in this instance. Because of 3 is offsuit, I could have like 3x of diamonds, and then he's in really bad shape. Like, what if I have 3-4 of diamonds, 3-5 of diamonds? So I hate his call in this situation, but he makes a loose call, holds, and scoops a monster pot. 2 hands later, I'm on the button with king 10 offsuit. Once again, it is a straddle pot. There's an early position opener, 230. I call on the button, obviously steaming a bit, but in position. This hand I think is fine to play deep. The small blind, the player from the previous hand with 5 deuce calls, and a limper calls as well. The flop is ace 10-10 with 2 diamonds. It checks to me. The pot is 120. I think this is a great spot to be betting big. I look like I'm steaming. On this board, there are some flush draws as well as the ace, so I expect an ace to never fold. There's no reason to be slow playing my hand. We want to be betting for value from the aces and the flush draws. The small blind now calls, and the original opener calls as well. The turn is an offsuit 5, which is a great card for me. Goes check, check to me, and I now bet 300. The small blind quickly calls, and the pre-flop opener folds. At this point, when the small blind calls, I think his hand is squarely going to be some ace x hands, some ace king, ace queen, possibly 10s as well, but I think a 10 is just going to jam on this turn. Specifically this player, I think if he has a 10, he's just always going to be check raising, maybe on the flop, possibly on the turn, but I don't think there's any way he's just going to be calling with a 10. So I think it's very likely that he has either like king, queen of diamonds, queen, jack of diamonds, or more likely, like I said, an ace. He is not a fan of folding. Obviously, looks like I'm steaming, so I'm praying for a great river here, some offsuit card, so I can rip it in. We go heads up to a river. which is an offsuit 7, perfect card. He checks, and I now jam my remaining $567. I'm just thinking here, there's just no way he can fold if he has an ace. I look like I'm steaming. He has a hard time folding anyway. So thankfully, he ends up calling with what he later says is ace-king, and he says he should have 3-betted pre-flop. I agree. I think this hand's going to be hard to play multi-way out of position. There's no reason that he shouldn't be 3-betting in an instance where he's probably going to have the best hand. He ended up getting himself into a tough spot post-flop and ended up paying me off. So I actually lost about 1,000 with the ace-5 of diamonds and kind of quickly got it back from this hand. So I think at this point I'm still stuck from the previous table, a couple $100. Now a few hands later, the aforementioned player with the 5 deuce, he opens again to 25. He gets 3 callers, and I'm in the big blind with pocket 8s. I call as well. The flop is 8-3 deuce with 2 clubs. Given that I had previously led with like a straight and flush draw, and now that I have a set, I think I want to be balancing my hands. It still looks like I could be kind of mixing it up a ton. So I decided to lead into the field for a small amount. I don't want this flop to check through, which I think it often will. If the pre-flop opener checks his like ace-x hands, I think it's going to check through a lot. And I don't want to be giving free cards to flush draws, as well as some possible gut shots, things of that nature. Obviously, I could check here. I think that's fine. But given how I played the flush draw previously, I just decided I wanted to be playing my sets kind of in the same manner. I bet 75 into 125, and unfortunately for me, it folds through. Pretty frustrating, but I think it's pretty obvious given that the pre-flop opener just kind of snapped full of his flop that he had like ace high. Obviously, I could have checked this, and maybe it checks through in some percentage of the time. He hits an ace or a king or a queen on the turn, and we play a big pot. Probably a mistake. I think I could just be checking and going with game flow here. I just decided that I wanted to balance, my flush draws and my sets in the same manner. Perhaps it's better to just always play out of position hands in game flow and check to the pre-flop raiser so that I'm not having to create some balanced strategy of what I am leading with, whether it's flush draws, sets, 2 pairs, things of that nature. In this next hand, under the gun +1 opens to 20. The button flats, and I have king jack of clubs in the big blind. I think his range here is going to be fairly strong. He hasn't been opening a lot, so I don't really want to be 3-betting this hand. I think it plays fine post-flop. Obviously, for 15 more, I don't want to be folding like suited Broadway cards, but at the same time, I think it could be in some tough shape here against his particular range. I think he's often going to have hands like ace-king, king-queen, ace-queen, things of that nature. But nonetheless, I didn't come here to fold, especially not 40% to the royal flush. I call, and we go 3 ways to a flop of king, jack, 5 with 2 diamonds. I check, the pre-flop opener checks, and now the button, a player I'm fairly familiar with, bets 50. He's playing 300, so when he bets this large on the flop, I think he's often going to have a king here himself, as well as some like combo flush draws, maybe ace-10 of diamonds, queen-10 of diamonds, things of that nature. I decided to just make it 300. I'm going to be playing my flush draws in this manner. I think if he has a king, he can't fold. If he has like this draw that I'm speaking of, he's not folding either. So I make it 300. Under the gun folds. He later ends up saying that he has ace-queen of clubs once he sees my hand. The button has king-queen, and we end up holding. The turn is a 9. The river is a brick. So that was obviously nice to pick that one up there. At this point, the player from the previous table with the 7 deuce that made a straight, she gets moved to our table. As I mentioned, she likes to limp a lot and call a lot of raises. She limps. I have king 10 of diamonds. Obviously, hand I'm going to be isolating in this situation. I make it 40. The small blind calls, a straddler calls, and she calls. We go 4 ways to a flop of king, queen, 7 rainbow. The blind checks. The straddler now bets 30, which is a really small bet. She folds. I think when he bets this sizing on this flop, a lot of times it's going to be some draws like jack 10, possibly some strong made hands like bottom set, as well as weak kings. I think often it's going to be things of like the weak king's nature, maybe king jack, king 9. Because he is in the straddle, I think he's going to be defending very wide here, especially this particular opponent. I decided to call. I think raising is probably overplaying my hand. If I raise and get re-raised, I'm going to have to fold. Now the player in the small blind, he calls as well. We go 3 ways to a turn of a 10. It now goes check, check to me. I think a lot of times when the small blind calls here, he's going to have some gut shots like ace-jack and jack-9. Because he was the first caller of my 40 in the small blind, I expect his range to be really strong. And because it's rainbow, I 100% think the nut gut shots and the gut shots are going to be floating here. So I don't really want to bet and get blown off my hand. Obviously, I could bet to protect myself against hands like King Jack, Jack 10, which now have picked up a decent amount of equity. But I decided to play my hand passively in position. Obviously, I think I'm going to have a huge advantage here in position, be able to put off a nice size bet on the river if it is a brick and I'm checked to. In hindsight, I actually like a fairly large bet here and just folding to a raise, because I think if I do get raised on this turn, they're just always going to have ace jack, jack 9, maybe king queen. I don't expect a hand to be bluffing here like jack 10 when I bet large. So I think betting large here to protect my hand and get value from hands like jack 10 and king jack is perfectly fine. So I think I like that play more. As I mentioned, I do check it back. The river now pairs the bottom card, and the small blind checks again. Now the original flop better leads for 40. Another small bet. I decided to just flat here. I think raising my hand is possibly overplaying it. I can also get overcalled by the small blind. I think if I raise here, my hand's going to look a lot like a 7, so I don't expect my hand to be called by worse. I think, oftentimes, like king queen, a 7 itself is going to call here, so I'm not getting those hands to fold anyway, and I think it's going to be hard to extract value from worse kings. Looking back on it, maybe I can make a pretty large exploitative raise and get called by kings I think they're going to be chopping here, like king jack, king 9, who expect the queen to play. As I mentioned, the small blind ends up calling, and it turns out that all three of us have a king. The small blind has king deuce, the straddler has king jack, so I got lucky against him with my king 10, making kings up. I think if I do raise here on the river, it's quite possible that I get a call from the king jack, expecting it to be chopped. Maybe some smallish raise, like 160, 170, something where it looks like I could be bluffing and I can get heroed with. So I think that ends up being my preferred line here. I think it's poorly played on my part. I should be betting the turn, and similarly I could be raising the river because his hand looks exactly like what it is. I shouldn't be scared thinking like, oh, like my hand is only going to look like a 7, so I can't be called by worse. I need to give my opponents the opportunity to be calling with worse here. If I'm going to be bluffing a lot in this situation, I should also be trying to eke out some value against the hands like king jack, king 9. I'm actually really surprised here that the small blind did have king deuce. It might have been king deuce suited, but as the first caller, that's really not what I thought he would have in this particular hand. In this hand, the girl limps once again. Not in my house! I have 6-4 of diamonds in position, and I isolate to 25. It folds to her, and she calls heads up. The flop is ace, king, queen, all clubs. This is obviously going to favor my range, not the limp caller's range. She checks, and I bet 35. I now see her look back at her cards, and she calls. I think in this instance, when she looks back at her cards, she's looking to see if she has a club, maybe the jack of clubs, the 10 of clubs. And when she calls, I expect her to have a lot of flush draws here. The turn is a small club. She checks. At this point, I have to check it back because I think she's going to have a flush and going to be check calling, especially if she's check calling the flop. She's obviously going to be looking to check call the turn once she makes a flush. Thankfully, the river is a king. Bingo! She bets 40. Once again, not in my house. Not going to have that here. It looks like she's blocker betting with a flush. I make it 240, and she pretty quickly side folds. Got to show it one time. I think I either showed like the 6 or the 4 of diamonds and kind of smiled. I think this is just a huge mistake. You don't want to be blocker betting on this type of board into a capable opponent. They're just often going to be turning whatever they have into a bluff. You pretty much telegraphed what your hand was, and especially with this sizing, and a better opponent is just going to know how to attack that. So unless your goal is to get raised here, I wouldn't be leading small. Now to the last hand of note. I open ace queen of hearts under the gun to 25. The player to my direct left calls, and the girl in the small blind calls as well. We go 3 ways to a flop of queen 9-4 rainbow. She checks. I bet 50 into 75. Now the player to my left makes it 130. She folds. I played actually a couple of pots similar to this against him in the last couple of days, in which he had flatted my big opens pre-flop. Once with kings, another time with ace jack suited. The king's time, he raised my flop bet when I'd flopped like top, and the other time I had ace queen on an ace jack board. I think I bet, and he raised with his top 2. So this felt kind of similar. Obviously, once I flopped top in this situation, I'm not just going to bet fold. I think sometimes here he could have some worse queens like king queen, queen jack, trying to figure out where they're at. So I call the 80 more. The turn is a 3 of spades, bringing out 2 spades. I check, and he thinks for a bit and bets 400. I think at this point when he bets this large, he's going to have some, really good value hands here like kings, similarly slow play like he did previously, possibly some sets like a pocket nines, maybe queen nine suited for top two. I'm going to guess if he's going to have a flush draw, it's going to be situation like maybe jack 10 suited. That's about the best hand that I can hope that he's going to have here that's going to be a semi-bluff. He has about 600 more. It feels like a situation where it's just too much of getting in 200 big blinds with top. He has done some spewy, spazzy things, but generally speaking, when he kind of makes these big bets, it's not going to be something that I'm going to have in like bad shape. Like I don't expect him to have king, queen, or queen, jack in this situation. I decided to fold. I tried to egg him on a little bit. I'm like, hey man, you should show a bluff. It'll be good for the game. And I'd like to know what you guys would do in this situation. Is this a spot where you're just check calling the turn once again, maybe folding to some rivers like a king, an 8, possibly a spade? Do you just rip in the turn here? So after I do tell him to show the bluff, he smiles and shows the jack 10 of spades. So sure enough, he flopped an open ender and then turns a flush draw as well. I think this is a pretty tough spot given how he was betting. I think he played it well. There's not much I can do here to continue with my one pair holding. After that hand, there wasn't much else of note. I ended up having to leave up a winner of 949. So good session. Obviously played some really big pots. The ace-5 suited versus the deuce-5 was one of them. If we win that flip, then we would have had a real nice solid like 3K plus day. Obviously, I'm going to take that spot always as far as him calling off there with deuce-5. If he'd like to call off there with bottom pair and a gut shot against my jamming range, he's more than happy to. So another good session. Thanks for watching. Another thing I wanted to bring up, if you haven't been watching Triton Poker on Twitch, they've been streaming some cash games, some short deck hold'em, which is really popular out in Asia now, where they remove the deuces through 5s. A couple of different rule changes as well. The ace plays as a 5 for a straight, so it's ace 6, 7, 8, 9 as a straight, and similarly a flush because it's mathematically harder to make. It now beats a full house. It's been really fun. The other day they streamed a €1 million cash game buy-in. You've got Patrick Antonius, Phil Ivey, Tom Dwan, a couple of rich Chinese billionaires. Really cool, fun times. I think they're going to be streaming some more cash games in the upcoming days, as well as some tournaments. Like I said, the short deck hold'em. Check that out. I don't think you're going to be disappointed. And as usual, thanks for watching the videos. I've been having a great time putting these together. I appreciate it. If you can, please like, subscribe. It's really going to help the channel. Thanks, guys. Catch you later. Not in my house! Not in my house!